My name is Craig Altemose. I'm the executive director of Better Future Project, which is an organization I started about 8 years ago after I graduated from Harvard Law and Harvard Kennedy School with law and policy degrees. And we have 3 programs focused on engaging people like you in the climate movement. We actually probably are best well known for 350 Massachusetts. So locally here in Massachusetts, which is part of the global 350.org organization, we have 17 chapters around Massachusetts, from the Berkshires to the Cape, from the North Shore to the South Coast, and have volunteers working to change climate policy at the town, city, and state level, particularly leaning into Massachusetts' historic role as a change agent, looking at marriage equality and universal health care as 2 issues that Massachusetts has led on, and looking to embrace a similar type of leadership with climate change. Our second program is called Divest Ed, which currently supports about 60 campuses around the country, supporting university students in campaigns to divest their schools' endowments from fossil fuel stocks. And then our third and final program, which is our newest one, is called Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, or CREW, which works to build neighborhood grassroots climate preparedness and social resilience to climate impacts. So that's kind of me and the work I've been doing, and in my talk this evening I really want to communicate 3 basic things to you all. 1, to really highlight the fact that this is a global challenge that we face, and really elevate the scale of that challenge, the severity of the challenge that we face. The second thing is to lay out my piece of the transition that I see coming and how I think we can partially accomplish that transition. And the third piece is to really challenge all of you, as Ian said, to think boldly, to think creatively, and to have fun this weekend. And so to start that first piece, there's a story I really like to tell that I think really, to me, perfectly encapsulates both the scale of the crisis and the global nature of it. And it's about a particular extreme weather event that hit Moscow in the summer of 2010. Is anyone familiar with that particular event? Anyone guess what kind of event we're talking about? Back left, the heat wave, yes. So it was not a very well covered weather event here in the United States, though if you've listened to, read, or watched our media, you may notice we're not very good at covering things outside of our boundaries. But this was a particularly bad heat wave for Russia, which, as you are aware, is not a place that you really associate with heat, right? Russia is a fairly cold country, so it's not, again, very well adapted to high temperatures. And before 2010, Russia had never seen temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in recorded history. So as long as we had thermometers, the temperature never went above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And that summer, Moscow broke that record. And then they broke it again. 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 8 times in a 2-week period, Moscow saw temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, for a city that is not prepared for that level of temperature, and let's be real, even in Massachusetts, where we get more hot days, we are not prepared for a heat wave of that magnitude. There was a lot of bad things that happened. It was, well, who here has lived without who here has lived without air conditioning? Raise your hand. So a lot of folks, right? I actually had air conditioning growing up. My wife grew up in Kentucky and did it, and she taught me a couple of tricks. One of them, which, because we don't currently have air conditioning, is that when it's really hot out, you close your windows during the day, you lower the blinds, try to keep the heat out, and then you open your windows at night when it gets cooler to let in that cool air to cool down your house, right? So, in Russia, I think some folks learned about that technique and started to deploy it fairly quickly. Obviously, there are probably a handful of wealthy folks who did have air conditioning, and other folks who were very lucky maybe got to the stores before they ran out of air conditioning, but for the rest of them, they were left to tricks like that and to use fans to try to stay cool. But the problem was that it was so hot in Moscow that summer that the forest near Moscow caught on fire. And huge plumes of smoke started coming into the city. And so I want you all to imagine yourselves in this scenario. Think about the last time you were in really hot weather with beads of sweat dripping down your face and stifling hot air around you. and think that maybe it's 102 degrees in your home, and outside maybe it's 90 degrees, about 12 degrees cooler. And you can open your window to let in that cool air, but you're letting in a bunch of smoke into your home. And I want you to think about what you would do in that moment. Who keeps their window down and bakes inside their home? Raise your hand. Who opens their window to let in that cooler, smoky breeze? Raise your hand. Who would leave Moscow? Right, so in some ways that's the right choice. But if you think again about the people who are able to make that choice, it's the more privileged members of society, right? People who have access to transportation, who have savings accounts with enough money in it where they can leave town, get hotel rooms, buy food, take care of themselves, pay for the gas. People who have flexible employment where they can just get out of town for 2 weeks and not get fired or not have that paycheck mean the difference between getting kicked out of their apartment that they rent. People who are physically able to leave and don't have infirmaries or elderly. People who don't have to worry about immigration status and the concern about being swept up in a random patrol because they're traveling. The people who stayed behind, and many people did leave Moscow. All the foreign embassies shut down. The United States Embassy cleared out all of our staff. But again, a lot of people, millions of people, either chose to or had to stay in Moscow. And 11,000 of those people who stayed, when forced between opening up those windows and breathing in that cool, smoky air, or closing their windows and baking inside their home, 11,000 people made the wrong choice. 11,000 people died from either smoke inhalation or heat exhaustion. When faced with two wrong, unfair choices, 11,000 people picked the wrong, unfair choice and died. 55,000 people across Moscow died that summer. And every single one of them was a human being with people in their lives who cared about them and relied upon them and who will never get to see them again. 55,000 people. And I wish that the story ended there, but it does not. Because that same heat wave that broke all those records, that killed 11,000 people in Moscow and 55,000 people across Russia, also decimated Russia's wheat harvest. And Russia is traditionally the third largest exporter of grain in the world. And so when there's less grain, which again is what we make pasta and bread out of, kind of the main staple food for much of Western civilization, the Russian leadership at that time, Medvedev was the president, I believe, and Putin was the prime minister. They swapped roles for a little while there. They decided to ban the export of wheat from Russia, right? Because there wasn't as much food. It's a fairly logical thing to say, well, let's keep what food we have for our people so that our people don't go hungry. Fairly rational thing from a national perspective. But that has big ripple effects across the rest of the world. Food prices across the world went up, right? Anyone study economics? When you reduce supply, price goes up. And there's a part of the world, politically unstable part of the world, fairly close to Russia, that historically imports 50% of its food from outside the region. Anyone know what that region is?
Syria.
Well, the Arab world more broadly. The Arab world, historically, you think about the Arab world, you think about deserts and oil, not lush green valleys of produce. 50% of the food that the Arab world eats comes from outside of the Arab world. The largest Arab nation, Egypt, historically imports half of its grain from Russia, specifically. So you can imagine on the streets of the Arab world what would happen if the third largest exporter of grain, the other two, by the way, are Australia and the United States, much farther away from the Arab world that are used to feeding other parts of the world than Russia. And as you folks may know or can envision, grain has a decent shelf life. It doesn't immediately spoil like bananas, right? So you've got grain silos, you can store grain, so the price spikes are not felt immediately when that export decision is cut off. But the price spikes were felt. And in December of 2010, a young man in Tunisia who could no longer afford to feed his family set himself on fire, burned himself to death. And that was literally the spark that started the Arab Spring. And in the spring of 2011, we saw revolutions break out across Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen, and yes, ultimately Syria, which also separately had been experiencing a lot of droughts. So all of the young men who are working in the countries, 90% of Syria's farms failed during these droughts separately. So you had all of these young men moving into the cities looking for work. And when revolutions started sweeping across other countries, all those young men were very eager, with nothing else to do, to take up the call. But let's be real, the revolutions that happened during the Arab Spring were not climate revolutions, right? They were not calling for carbon emission reductions. They were calling for things like democracy, human rights, freedom, and probably, yes, economic security as well, right? But those same desires and yearnings and demands for freedom, for democracy, for human rights were present in the Arab world in the spring of 2008, in the spring of 2009, in the spring of 2010, and they would have been there in the spring of 2012 and 2013. The reason these revolutions broke out in the spring of 2011 was because the price of food was higher. And when you could no longer afford to feed your family, suddenly the risks of going out to protest dictatorship got a lot smaller by comparison. Because what can they do to you that's worse than watching your children starve to death, right? Suddenly that's not as scary a thought about being thrown into prison and tortured. Because your kids don't have food. So all of these changes, and we flash forward almost a decade there from the Arab Spring, a decade forward, 8 years forward. You've had multiple regimes fall, multiple civil wars break out, hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced, forced to flee their countries, and then when they seek refuge in new countries, provoking xenophobia, Islamophobia, fear of the other, the desire to close borders. All of this from an approximate 1 degree Celsius rise in temperatures. Those of you who study the science know that we are currently on track to see 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius rise in temperature by the end of the century. And that is not a linear curve of damages, that is an exponential curve. We are poised to get so much worse. So this is literally a matter of life and death for not just us as humanity, but for us as creatures on this earth. Folks have probably seen the recent news that 1 million species are on the verge of extinction right now out of 8 million. And again, that number will go up. We're currently living through the 6th great extinction in the history of the planet. The 4.5 billion, well, maybe 4 billion years or so Earth has been around. The 6th great extinction right now. By comparison, the 5th great extinction killed off 97% of life on Earth. Our temperatures are going up 10 times as fast as the 5th great extinction, which knocked out 97% of life on Earth. Let that sink in for a moment. 10 times faster. So we've got a pretty big challenge before us. Anyone not depressed yet? I can go on, but I think in the interest of time, I'm gonna
Waiter, cocktail.
pivot. The good news, and there is good news, is that we know what we need to do to address this problem. We have the technology. We know how to build solar panels and build wind turbines. We know how to reforest deserts. We know how to grow more food locally. We know how to retrofit buildings so you don't need to have fossil fuels used to heat them. We know how to do electric vehicles and high-speed rail. Every single ounce of CO2 that is burned and put into the atmosphere requires a human being to do something to create that process, to do that burning. There's human agency all over this thing. And the question is, can we motivate ourselves politically, economically, to achieve a fast transition? The good news is that there are historical examples of us achieving a similar pace of transition. The one I like to cite the most is honestly the switch of the United States economy from a civilian, consumer-based economy focused on producing consumer goods to a wartime economy focused on producing weapons during World War II. As folks know, we were bombed in 1941 in December, and in the beginning of 1942, President FDR laid out a bold speech to Congress with a powerful vision calling for 60,000 aircraft to be built. In context, in 1940, the year before Pearl Harbor, we had built 4,000 aircraft, which was the record for us. So again, 15 times as many aircraft to be built, and some people thought that was an overly ambitious vision. There were similarly ambitious visions for the number of tanks and armored vehicles and other stuff we should build, and naval ships and so on. But other people appreciated that 60,000 may be unrealistic, but it's good to have big, ambitious visions that ground you so that you're not just shooting for 4,000 or 8,000, and we might not get 60,000, but we could get 15,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 or whatever it is better than what we were doing before. And we really saw our country come together during that point. And we made this shift. We had 50% of our food was grown in people's backyards and front yards as victory gardens. Corset manufacturers started making gun belts. Merry-go-round manufacturers were making gun turrets. And car manufacturers stopped producing civilian automobiles for several years and just focused on building armored vehicles, tanks, and aircraft engines. And from when FDR gave that speech, the beginning of 1942, until the end of 1944, we didn't build 4,000 aircraft or 60,000 aircraft, we built 216,600 aircraft, which is how we managed to take down the combined might of Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. And certainly, in that moment, we were building weapons of war, which is not, thank God, what we need to do this time. We need to build wind turbines and solar panels and change the insulation of our buildings and plant more trees, plant more local agriculture, get off of the industrial agriculture system, the meat system that we have. But these are things that make our communities cleaner, healthier, and more whole. And no one has to die. In fact, many, many lives will be saved. So economically, we can do this. But the question is, what is going to be that same political spark that Pearl Harbor wound up needing to be for World War II? But it's not just war that has motivated a similar level of political change or political consensus. If you look back to the birth of the original environmental movement in the late 60s and early 70s, you similarly saw a fairly rapid pivot in change in a political consensus that provoked economic changes. 20 million Americans took to the streets on Earth, the first Earth Day in 1970. And then they voted out a bunch of members of Congress who were seen as being in league with dirty industry. And over the next several years, we saw an onslaught of new environmental regulations, including the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act, all of which were signed into law by Richard Nixon. Not because he was a tree hugger hippie, but because he recognized that there was popular demand, and he feared the popular will if he did not take these steps. And he actually proclaimed himself to be the environmental president in the early 1970s, and that was the legacy he had wanted to leave, the whole impeachment thing. And again, not because he cared about it, but because the people showed that they cared and there were political consequences for their leaders who didn't. And in that time, again, it wasn't war that motivated it, it was art. It was photographs of rivers on fire. It was books like Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. that brought forth the reality of our environment's destruction and the need to move off of it. So what are the images? What are the stories that we need to tell in the 21st century to get us to take climate change as seriously as we took Nazi and Japanese imperialism, or rivers catching on fire and pesticides killing birds? That's not something I have a full answer to. I think one piece for me is that if you think about going back to the World War II example, people say, well, that only happened because we were attacked by the Japanese, right? But break that down a little bit. Who was the we there? Americans, right? In the 1940s, the vast majority of Americans had never been to Hawaii, had never met a Hawaiian, had never met someone who had been to Hawaii. Hawaii was a territory, not even a state yet. It wouldn't become a state until 1959. And yet there is this narrative out there, this myth, that all of us as Americans had our fates tied together. Right? A story that someone living in the middle of Kansas was intricately connected to people living on an island in the middle of the Pacific. We are now in a place in human history where quite literally all of our fates are tied together. We will sink or swim as one. National borders, wealth, skin color, religion, none of that will protect you from climate change. No laws on pieces of paper, no treaties signed on pieces of paper can protect you from climate impacts. And certainly there are many people who are going to suffer more and suffer first, and indeed are already suffering, and they tend not to look like this crowd. They tend to have a darker skin color. People of color, people in the global south, low-income people, the very young, the very old, all of the folks that all of our religious texts tell us to look after are the ones who are currently feeling the burden of climate change, but it's coming for all of us unless we do something. There's an old Chinese proverb that I like to cite. It says, "To know and not to act is not to know." And I think you have to appreciate that any human being who actually truly knew the stakes of the climate crisis, and had the ability, as we all do in this room, and other people outside of this room have more, the ability to do something about it, that they would. Even the head of ExxonMobil or the head of Saudi Arabia, if they actually knew. And when I say no, this is to me where we have art and science coming together. Because there is the intellectual understanding, but then there is the emotional understanding in your heart and in your gut. And you can intellectually know the seriousness of climate change, but then you step outside and all of the signals of the world, it's a little bit dreary out today, but it doesn't look like the world's about to collapse, right? Everyone's out there having a good time, particularly here in Provincetown, walking around. It's going to be sunnier tomorrow. The world looks okay. And so we need this partnership of what science can tell us that looking around the world doesn't tell us, right? That we are in serious jeopardy as a species and as a planet. But we have to go beyond that to get art to tell us how to feel about that, what to do with that knowledge, how that unsettles us, and provokes us to be more courageous and to be more bold, to be more compassionate. So that is our challenge for this weekend. How do we pair two of these pivotal parts of human existence, of art and science, to come up with global scale solutions for climate change? Because again, this is a global problem, and it's somewhat ironic, because honestly, it is the forces of imperialism and colonialism and globalism that have resulted in in the kind of exporting the model of the Western civilization of exploitation and domination over the natural world and over other peoples treated as inferior. That global model is what is putting us in jeopardy. And yet at the same time, that global model was so effective at taking over the world that we have no choice but to have global scale solutions, even if those solutions are locally rooted, as many of them will have to be. They will need to be locally rooted, but everywhere. And as Ian said, there are so many barriers around politics and language that make it harder for us to transcend those barriers, but art is one of the ways that we can. So I really invite you all to take the risk of being big thinkers this weekend. We need creativity, we need courage, we need the best of all of us and a lot more. So I'm looking forward to the discussions. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions.
Just to start the conversation a little bit, you, in your description of the Pearl Harbor attack, you described it as Americans rallying around the territory of Hawaii. But wouldn't you really consider that Americans' military installation was attacked and thousands of military personnel were killed? Wouldn't you consider that more of a rallying call to that situation? And therefore, like today, we can frame climate change as a national security issue. So I'm just wondering if we could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, I think that's a fair point. You're absolutely right. There was a United States military installation that was primarily attacked. And I think folks certainly have more identity with that, with the U.S. military than with the state of Hawaii as a whole. But still, again, we had, the population of the U.S. was not quite 300 million that it is now, but it was, probably 100 million people. And again, how many of them personally knew those people? There was a myth about those people being connected to us. There was a story, a narrative about we are one American nation that brought them all together. And I think, again, we need new paradigms that recognize our connected nature to the folks in other Pacific Island nations right now that are going underwater quite literally and losing their islands, not just because it's the moral thing to care about them, but because they are the canaries in the coal mine. And what is happening to them is going to happen to us. Maybe we aren't all going to go underwater, but we are going to see our lands become unlivable in various ways, whether that's droughts or wildfires or superstorms, or the melting of rivers that feed our agricultural systems. The melting of glaciers that feed our rivers, that feed our agricultural systems. But to your point about the military, yes, I think you absolutely can talk about climate change as a national security threat. The Pentagon calls climate change a threat multiplier and has set out some fairly robust goals, under the Obama administration, which I think have still carried forward to the Trump administration to reduce their contribution. The U.S. Navy wants to have half of its fleet be on non-fossil fuel energy by 2020 was the last I heard. And they were on course to achieve that, which is one of the most aggressive of such targets I've heard. But the U.S. military is also a very large consumer of fossil fuels, and arguably, depending on how you count it, among the world's largest consumers of fossil fuels. So again, I think you can paint this as a national security challenge, and I think some will, and that may have some positive impacts. But at the end of the day, national boundaries are not going to stop this thing. Again, we need a more evolved global consciousness. We can build as tall of a wall we want on the Mexican border, but that's not going to keep out all of the people who want to get into our country when their countries fail because they are no longer inhabitable. And so I do think that the national security frame has limitations, even as it has some short-term promise. And again, perhaps we should seize that short-term promise, but I don't think that's how we solve this long-term. Next question.
So Craig, I'm from north of the border, so I'm therefore a socialist. And the American narrative has for years and years been the land of freedom, opportunity, independence, seeking what you deserve as your own birthright, and so on and so on. So I'm curious what you would see as a new narrative. So I lived in India for 5 years as well, up until 3 years ago. So I was on the front lines of seeing Indian middle class people aspire to the cultural export of the American lifestyle. So what would you say, how would you rewrite the narrative, I guess, to people in developing countries and elsewhere in the world who look to the American model because it's been so successfully, exported and otherwise glorified? How would you change that narrative, or what would that narrative look like so that people still feel this sense of progress and an opportunity to, provide for their families, but not go down a carbon-intensive lifestyle that we know has led us into the problem that we're in?
It's a great question. And I think the good news is that narrative is actually already starting to change. If you compare I read a really great book about called The European Dream a number of years ago. And as Americans have historically been living further and further away from each other, Europeans have actually had their houses get closer to each other. I think honestly, among millennials today, there's a real drive to live in cities, to live in urban areas, to not own a car, and to be more comfortable renting instead of owning homes in smaller apartments. And I think that to me is part of it, is that thirst for community. I mean, the reason we're all here in Provincetown is not because we each get our own mansion, but because there's so much to do in 8 city blocks, right? That there's all these great culture and art and restaurants and bars, and certainly the beach is a nice attraction as well. But that proximity to each other, that is the strength. It's the community, right? Not the I'm on my own in the middle of the woods by myself and I need a giant mansion for myself and my 2 kids and my wife. That was the myth that was deliberately created to sell more stuff, and including automobiles, right? To make people get out of the city so they would buy the cars, and which is one of the biggest consumer purchases that we still are tricked into making these days. Tens of thousands of dollars for something that immediately loses value as soon as you start using it. So I think that narrative, again, it's the community. It's recognizing that if you have neighbors and friends you can count on, when the hurricane comes into town, you're going to be a lot better off than if you've got a really giant house out by yourself in the suburbs where you don't know anyone and you don't have friends that you can turn to. So I don't know that that's the whole narrative, but I think to me that's a big piece of it.
Craig, one more question?
Yeah.
Thanks, Craig. I really appreciated your framework on this. I'm Hillary.
Hello, Hillary.
I'm from Arizona State. And something you said where you talked about how we have good solar panels, battery technologies are there, we can make electric cars. And that language of, let's call it adaptation and mitigation, that we have to change what we're doing, is one I struggle with a lot. I'm a scientist, not an artist by any stretch. People don't like to change what they're doing most of the time. Now, your initial story set us up to realize that if we don't change, we're going to suffer. So we've got mitigate, adapt, and maybe suffer, which isn't all that great. And I really like your positive sort of framing about we need to think differently about what we do. So I guess the question I have, and I'm going to use the term intervention, we could decide to design a climate future that we want to live in. how do we get people to think creatively about what that designed future is going to look like? Because people want to do stuff, right? I talked to my dad, or I talked to a taxi driver about the climate situation, and everybody is basically demoralized about it. So how do we get people to think about the doing part of it?
It's a great question. And I think I very much agree with what you said, and I want to push back on a little bit in that, there's this notion that I agree with you, people don't like change. But at the end of the day, people actually, what they want is different than what they have right now. And for instance, people don't want fossil fuels, they want energy. And they're fairly agnostic. And in fact, I think most of them, if given the choice, would actually absolutely choose to get energy from clean sources instead of dirty sources. But it's the energy they want, not coal or oil or gas. And I think that's a key thing for us all to remember. Sorry.
So the problem is there's not enough examples of what can we do.
Yes, sorry. So, yeah, I mean, there are an increasing number of examples of what folks can do. And the really interesting thing for me is, I'm an activist. I do advocacy. I try to get people involved in pushing for policy change. And my thinking on this was that people who believed in climate change would be more likely to recycle or to ride a bike instead of drive their car. And it's actually the inverse is true, that people who feel like they have agency over the problem, people who have opportunities to recycle, who are able to ride their bike, are more likely to accept the science of climate change. Because psychologically, it actually doesn't make sense to expend a lot of mental energy, evolutionarily, it doesn't make sense to expend a lot of mental energy on a problem that you have no ability to address. Right? Like, that's just wasted energy. Why would you think about that if you can't possibly address it? And so it's really important to think through what are the steps people can take to be part of the climate movement. And I think like there's a long laundry list of things that people can do from, I think on the bigger end, the bigger steps are flying less, not eating meat, biking to work instead of driving, or at least reducing how many trips you take in your car versus that you walk or take a bicycle in. Again, living in an urban area where you have less of a footprint, where you have to heat and cool fewer spaces. A lot of, at least here in Massachusetts, you can get a free energy audit where people will come to your home for free and tell you how you can, at zero or low cost, make your home more efficient. They're heavy, you can get like 75% off the cost of a new boiler if you need a new boiler, that kind of stuff. And again, just reduce energy conservation. And then again, like having a garden, growing more food so that instead of having food trucked over on a truck from California, it's coming from your backyard. And there's zero carbon footprint from that. And it's fresher and healthier. You can control what pesticides are put on it or not. So there are a lot of things people can do. And one of my favorites that we started to do with Crew, we stole from others, it was not our idea, but is depaving. So in urban areas in particular, I live in the community of Somerville, which is, I think like 90+% is like pavement or concrete surfaces. And so when it rains, there's nowhere for the water to go other than either into the sewers, which get backed up, or into people's basements, right? And so if you have people who own a paved patio or a driveway that can fit 4 cars and they only have 2 cars, some people are voluntarily saying, hey, can I get a crew of people over to my home and we'll together take some pickaxes and literally rip up the pavement or the concrete and replace that with gardens or other green spaces that both then help with rainwater retention and help with excessive rainfall, which this part of the country is going to be getting wetter as climate change gets worse. And it helps with the urban heat island effect, because instead of that pavement soaking up heat, you instead have plants that help cool the city down. So it's a small step, but taken in aggregate form can have a decent impact across the city and across the country. So there are a lot of things people can do, and yes, but I think honestly that the biggest thing I would say people can do is to be politically involved. I approach this from a political mindset, and I think we do need people pushing policymakers to take bold action and as with the Earth Day movement, threaten to vote them out or run against them yourself if they are not approaching this with the appropriate level of urgency. That's my particular piece, but yeah.